this week as I was rereading Daniel, I had this verse that kept popping up in my head, and I couldn't get it out. And as I was mulling it over through this week, I wanted to share this verse first and foremost. The verse is Daniel 4, and it's 34b. And it says there, "For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation." That just was rattling around in my head. And as I kind of was thinking that over, the Lord brought to my mind another verse. Psalm 145. It's a very similar in chapter, Psalm 145, verse 13. It's a similar passage. And it says there, "Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and your dominion reigns throughout all generations." Both of these verses, they basically say the same concept. God's rule is forever. Other kingdoms are going to rise and other kingdoms are going to fall, but God's kingdom outlasts all. In history proves this very fact. One look at the world, you can kind of see how quickly one world power rises and then how it goes. And the next world power rises and then it goes. And the next world power rises and it goes. I have a little video. It's a quick video that kind of explains this and shows it. So here it is. As you can see, that's just kind of the Middle East and Europe and that type of section, how much this is just kind of swept from one rising to falling, to one rising to one falling. I want to assure you that God, He is in control. God is sovereign, and He is in control of absolutely everything. If you're just joining us, we are in the book of Daniel. We are in the sermon series, Daniel, Serving the Sovereign God. Last week we looked at chapter 5. And as chapter 5 closes, a new government has taken over control. The Medo-Persian Empire is now on the scene. And you see that as it wraps up in Daniel 5, 30 through 31. It says, "That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. Historically, this is a very interesting empire. If you ever look into the Medo-Persian Empire, it is what is known as a dual empire. You had Darius the Mede, and he was this great conqueror. He came through, and he was the one that was responsible for conquering the Babylonian Empire. He was the brainchild behind that. But his counterpart is Cyrus the Persian. He would be the one that would eventually reign supreme in this territory. A little tidbit about Cyrus. The name might sound a little familiar, and this is a little tidbit that will blow your mind away. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to Isaiah 45. I'm going to read verses 1 through 7. It says there, "Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed." Just to say, this is the very same Cyrus that we're talking about. "Thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed, whom I have taken by the right hand to subdue nations before him, and to loose the loins of kings, to open doors before him, so that gates will not be shut. I will go before you and make the rough places smooth. I will shatter the doors of bronze and cut through their iron bars. I will give you the treasures of darkness and hidden wealth of secret places, so that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who calls you by your name. For the sake of Jacob my servant, and Israel my chosen one, I have also called you by your name. I have given you a title of honor, though you have not known me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I will gird you, though you have not known me. The men may know from the rising to the setting of the sun that there is no one besides me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. The one forming light and creating darkness, causing well-being and creating calamity. I am the Lord who does all these." Now, what makes this a really crazy thing is this is a prophecy that happens 200 years before Cyrus was born. And this is Isaiah the prophet that is pronouncing this. So back to Darius. We're not going to deal much with Cyrus today. But Darius, he takes over this Babylonian territory, the Babylonian Empire. And it's during this time of transition that we have the backdrop to our story today. The very famous story of Daniel and the lion's den. Today, we have entitled today's sermon, "What's Eating You?" All right? Before we dive into it, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you today. I thank you, Lord, for this book. Lord, I thank you for the journey that we have taken so far through the book of Daniel. And God, I just thank you how you've challenged my heart. Lord, how you've spoken to me. And God, I pray as a congregation, Lord, that we too have heard from you. Lord, that you have met with us and that you have challenged us, Lord, to serve the sovereign God. Help us, Lord, where we can't do it. And Lord, pick up the slack where we are absolutely inept. Lord, and may we be willing to humble ourselves and allow you control of all things. God, we thank you, and we just commit the rest of the service into your hands. We praise in your name. Amen. The Medo-Persian Empire, it replaces the Babylonian Empire. And Daniel, he is transitioned into that government. Daniel, he starts off being highly respected. He was put in a place of prominence. He was kind of like the prime minister. It was that type of role that he filled. And that's where Daniel is. And in Daniel chapter 6, we'll start in the first 3 verses. It says in Daniel 6, 1 through 3, "It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps, because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. It's just really interesting. Darius, he had this plan. And it was this trickle-down system of a plan that he had put in place. Darius, the king, he was the head. Outside of him, he had 3 commissioners, one of whom was Daniel, and Daniel was being set apart even from them as kind of the second in command, so to speak. And then underneath them, they had this 120 satraps, which were kind of like governors of provinces, is kind of the function that they used. If something was to happen in the Medo-Persian Empire, this strategy would allow the king to hear about it as quickly as possible, to understand what was happening, and to be able to address or squelch or do any kind of thing that was necessary at that point. I just find it interesting. And we see this thread from the beginning of Daniel all the way up to this point. There is a consistent thread that Daniel's reputation preceded him. Daniel, he was thought highly by King Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel, he was again elevated under the reign of King Belshazzar. And I don't know how many foreign people, these may be prisoners of war that were there. I don't know how many of them were high-ranking officials in the Medo-Persian Empire specifically, but I can assure you that Daniel was one of them, if not the only one of them. In Daniel 6:4, it says this: Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Again, this is an incredible and an absolutely impressive reputation that Daniel has. It is hard to find any politician today who this could be said about. Something like, there is no evidence of corruption. There is nothing that could be used to make any accusation against him. That he is a faithful person who gives great care, and he is not involved in anything that is corrupt. What incredible things are said about Daniel. Daniel, he was what is known as completely above reproach. That idea of above reproach, it means without handles. There was nothing that Daniel could be held back by, nothing that could pull him down. There was nothing in Daniel's life, that could be used against him. Because Daniel, if you really want to summarize Daniel, Daniel was a man of integrity. He was the same person behind closed doors as he was in the public. Daniel was a man of character, and he was a man who had faith in the Almighty Sovereign God. After not finding any kind of thing that could hold Daniel down, or to be able to remove Daniel from office, you see the story continue on in verse 5. And it says there, Then these men, they said, We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel, unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. Remarkable. Nothing can be held against Daniel. So these guys, they target Daniel through Daniel's commitment to God. Now, I don't know about anybody else here, but I personally wish that it could be said of me that Jonathan is so above reproach that we're going to catch him because of his devotion to God. That is pretty remarkable. Verses 6 and 9. It says, Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius, live forever. all the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is, the injunction. I want you to get this. Okay? These people in these government offices, they come before the king. And they're asking for the king to put in place a legal document. And this legal document, it basically states that for 30 days, anyone who looks to someone else for security, or looks to someone else and you elevate that person or God to a place of higher esteem than King Darius, then that person would be cast into a den of very hungry, ravenous lions. Here's the thing about the laws of the Medes and Persians. When you look into this, if there was a decree that was signed, if a legal document was signed by the king, then that law, that legal document, it was a binding document. And there was nothing that could make it be undone. There was nothing that could revoke that document. It was put in place and it was firmly etched in stone. It was the law of the land. It was an unchangeable law. Even the king himself could not go back on what was said. If someone was to break this law, then they would be thrown in a pit that was filled with hungry, ravenous lions, which were just waiting their visit. In Daniel 6:10, it says this. Now when Daniel knew that the document was signed. Let me stop there for a second. I want you to know that Daniel, he knew that this law was signed, that this law, it was in existence, and Daniel knew it. And that's very important, because it wouldn't have changed Daniel's devotion to God. Daniel was going to be the same in his relation to God. He was going to be as committed regardless of this law. Daniel, he was going to continue to serve the sovereign God. He had purposed in his heart to do so. And so in Daniel 6:10 it says, now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Daniel, he basically continued his daily routine. This daily routine of praying and worshiping God. This was something that was so ingrained with him that regardless of the law of the land, it was a non-negotiable in his life. He was going to continue to worship the God he served. 3 times a day. 3 times a day, Daniel went into this special place in his house. A place that he has designated to worship and pray to God. And he prayed and he thanked God these 3 times throughout the day. You know, I tend to think that if Daniel's previous practice was this, that these government officials, they probably at some point, they saw this happening. And this was probably what was piquing their interest, getting their thoughts together as they were conspiring against Daniel. It makes me think, are we creatures of habit when it comes to our time with the Lord? Is there a time in our life that is just a non-negotiable time where I'm going to be before God and everything else can go away, but this time I'm going to be with God. I'm going to read His Word. I'm going to pray to the God of the universe. I'm going to know him. I'm going to worship him. Would our daily routine of prayer, worship, would that find us guilty if we were in the same shoes as Daniel? Would we be found as unwavering in our commitment to the God of the universe? I hope that's the case. In Daniel 6:11, then these men, it's those government officials, then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Those government officials, they had baited the hook. And they were waiting for Daniel. And Daniel, being the creature of habit that he is, he wasn't going to be the guy who forsook God. He was going to continue to do this. Daniel, he ends up taking the bait. And after conspiring together, these government officials, they go and they check on Daniel. And they find Daniel praying to God. Shocker. Just as they kind of assumed would be the case. In Daniel 6:12, then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? The king replied, the statement is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. These guys were tattletales. That's what I think of. When I read this, it's like, wow, guys, you're tattletales. They caught Daniel in this web of deceit. And instead of going and confronting Daniel and trying to talk to him about this, no. It wasn't about that. They had a little bent out of shape. Maybe it was because Daniel was elevating up into position over them. I don't know all of their motives. But they ended up going out of their way, and they cast this net of deception. And they catch Daniel in this legal entrapment. And they go directly to the king, and they rat him out. As I was thinking this over, my son came to my mind. Now, it wasn't long ago that we celebrated Mother's Day here. And we gave out those little chunks of chocolate. They were great. And the mothers, we gave them out to all the ladies here. Well, there were a few extra leftover ones. And, well, you can't let those things go to waste. So I was eating, occasionally, sporadically, a little piece of chocolate. And so I go on up, and Ashley's upstairs, and she's changing Luke, and I'm on my way to the bedroom, and I'm chewing, and I get it down, and make sure there's no evidence. And I go on in to see Luke. And I give him a kiss, and as I bend down, this little rat, over and over and over again, he goes, Daddy chocolate? Daddy chocolate? It's like, dude! Don't rat me out. He's a little tattletale. Word of the wise, if you're trying to sneak food, please, do not go anywhere near my son. He will rat you out. He's like the food police. Woo, woo, woo. Daddy chocolate. Thank you. So, keep that in your mind. But these government officials, they go to King Darius, and they basically tattle on Daniel. And King Darius, he reiterates this ironclad law that he was the one, that he was the king that signed this into existence. And it couldn't be ratified. It couldn't be changed. It couldn't be annulled. It couldn't be undone. In Daniel 6:13, it says this, Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. So if I could summarize it, these are really the charges that these government officials bring before the king about Daniel. Daniel prays too much. Daniel, his relationship with God, it's too visible. And Daniel's commitment to God, it is so ingrained into every part of his life that it's a little obnoxious. Listen to the response that King Darius gives in the next verse. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. The news of Daniel. This is very interesting. Daniel, at this point, King Darius, he had only known him for a little bit of time. But the news of Daniel, who is now 83 to 85, somewhere in that bracket, this news of him technically breaking the law, it deeply distresses, it grieves King Darius's heart. And as I said, I find it a little bit interesting that King Darius, after roughly 2 years of knowing Daniel, that's how long he's really known Daniel at this point, that King Darius, he had such a fondness for Daniel. The news of this foreigner that was going to be cast into a den of lions, he has such a fondness for Daniel that his heart grieves for him after only knowing him for 2 years. I want you to put this in perspective. I have been here at this church as the pastor for just over 2 years. And I don't know, as I think about that, as I think about all of time and all of history, 2 years seems so small. It's a blip on the screen. But when I've been here for 2 years, I have made such wonderful connections. When you guys cry, I cry. When you guys are going through awesome experiences, I go through them with you. I feel as though our hearts have been knit. We're tied together. God is using these relationships. So maybe as I really back myself away from this, only 2 years, I think the bonds you can have quite firm, quite strong relationship bonds with people in just 2 years. But that obviously was the case with King Darius and Daniel. It is probable that Daniel, he was found praying at the start of the day. One of his routine, one of the starting days, it might have been the very moment. A lot of commentaries believe it was the very first of the 3 times that Daniel would pray and worship the Lord. So immediately upon seeing this, these government officials, they go off to tattle on Daniel to the king. And as they go on off, it is safe to say that King Darius, all day long, he is trying everything he can to change, to tweak, to adjust this legal document, to just undo what was done. And then at sunset. Sunset comes, and these government officials, they come back. And you see what they say in Daniel 6, 15 to 16. Then these men came by agreement to the king, and said to the king, "Recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians, that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed." Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you." So not only are these government officials tattletales that are quick to rat on Daniel, they are the type of people who would use the king's words against him. King Darius, his hands are tied with all of this. There was nothing that he could do to reverse, to change, or annul this legal document that had been enacted. King Darius had signed this into existence. There was nothing that could be done. It was a law of the land. Now, unable to do anything, King Darius, he orders that Daniel was to be thrown in the lion's den. This lion's den that was filled with lions that were hungry and ready for Daniel's arrival. But I find it interesting, in these two verses, just before Daniel is cast into the lion's den, King Darius speaks to Daniel. Now, I don't know if this was just a private conversation that he had between him and Daniel, like he whispers it in his ear, or if it was something that was more of a public thing that was directed towards Daniel. We're not really given a lot of the details there, but this is what he said. Your God, whom you serve, will himself deliver you. Again, for tops, 2 years, Daniel's commitment to serve the sovereign God, it was visible. Again, Daniel, he had purposed in his heart to follow and to serve God. And people had recognized this difference from chapter 1, all the way up to chapter 6. They've seen this difference in Daniel. And the story goes on, verses 17 through 19. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace, and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Then the king arose at dawn, at the break of day, and went in haste to the lion's den. Now, I'm not exactly sure what this process of sealing Daniel, of locking him in was, but it had something to do, and the whole purpose was to ensure that no one could get to Daniel, or that Daniel could somehow get out. He was locked in. He was going to be right in this lion's den until someone came and unmoved the stone, unlocked it in some fashion. This measure was put in place to just ensure that Daniel would stay put. With Daniel locked in, King Darius, he goes back home to his palace. And all this night, he doesn't eat. And he doesn't have any entertainment come before him. And he doesn't even sleep. So all this night, it's kind of this tossing and turning. I kind of picture this struggle emotionally that King Darius is going through. Daniel made such an impact on King Darius that after roughly 2 years, King Darius, he is grieving over Daniel. There is this physical ailment of sorts, this grief into his physical body, where he wouldn't even want to eat, doesn't want to be entertained, and he can't even sleep. It's kind of getting in the way of his entire life. I guess you could say, it is safe to say that King Darius, he probably thought of Daniel as some kind of a friend. At some level, there was this friendship that had formed over these 2 years. And at the first chance that King Darius has, King Darius, he rushes off to the lion's den. And I want you to listen to what actually happens. This is pretty remarkable. Listen where the story starts to kick up another notch. In verse 20, when he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? I picture this in my mind as King Darius is running off to the lion's den. I can see him coming, and he's shouting. He is yelling to Daniel. Hey, Daniel, are you okay? Are you still alive in there? Everything okay? Did your God rescue you, Daniel? He's shouting it as he comes. Obviously, King Darius, he recognized the source of Daniel. All these things that it took so many other kings so long to acknowledge and recognize, King Darius seemed to recognize it a little faster. He recognized the source to Daniel's abilities, to his rising in the kingdom. It had to do with the God he served. King Darius, he knew that Daniel, he consistently, constantly served the sovereign God. And King Darius, he believed that it was possible that Daniel's God could rescue Daniel from the lion's den. And knowing all of this, I try to process it. And when you go back and you think about when King Darius went and he fasted, it is possible, it is maybe even probable that fasting, it was coupled with praying at the same time to this God of Daniel. I'm not sure, but it's possible. So with the question echoing, has your God been able to deliver you from the lions? This is what happens next. Then Daniel spoke to the king. O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me. And as much as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. Hearing this, I have to imagine this just gave a huge relief to King Darius. It just kind of swept over him at this point. Daniel's God, he did the unthinkable. He did the unbelievable. Daniel, he had been rescued from these hungry, ravenous lions. And the reason for it is Daniel was an innocent man. He had done nothing wrong. In 23 and 24, then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The king gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Grimm's fairy tales, but this kind of has like a Grimm's fairy tales ending. Just as we're approaching that happily ever after, it's like, boom, absolute terribleness happens to all bad guys. The only difference is between Grimm's fairy tales and this story is this actually happened. This is an actual historical, awful thing that took place to these guys who maliciously accused Daniel, and it also happened to their children and their wives. Daniel, he is brought out of the lion's den, and then these government officials who accuse Daniel, along with their children and their wives, they are thrown into the lion's den. Before they could even reach the bottom, these lions, which are now super hungry because they didn't get to eat anything all night long, they are incredibly ravenous. Before they can even hit the ground, these lions, they pounce and they devour this potentially sizable group of people. It's possible, as you kind of think about some of this, it's possible that the reason for such a harsh punishment, it had something to do with this accusation being against a prime minister. That would have been a capital offense. It would have been a punishment that was worthy of death. Josephus, a historian, he puts it this way, and he has an interesting theory to it. The enemies of Daniel, when they saw no hurt came to him, would not ascribe it to the providence of God, but to the lions being full of food, upon which the king ordered much meat to be given them, and then the men to be cast into them, to see whether, because of their fullness, they would come unto them or not. And the lions had the mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces, and they came to the bottom of the den. The lions, they seized them at once, and though they did all they could to defend themselves, fighting with them, the lions were too powerful for them, and overcame them. And not only did it tear off their flesh, but broke their bones in pieces. And that they, as they were falling, before they came to the bottom, or the lower part of the den, this was a plain proof that it was not through fullness or want of appetite that the lions did not fall upon Daniel and devour him. It's an interesting theory. It is also probable that the children and the wives, why they were cast in, there's a few theories around that. Perhaps the children and wives, they were encouragers or approvers of this decision to kind of go after Daniel. And the government officials, their motive to kind of get at Daniel. Perhaps they were echoing and chirping behind the scenes. It's also possible that the children and their wives, they were innocent. They had nothing to do with it, but as one ancient writer put, he put it this way, when he's referring to the Persians, he said this: the laws among them are formidable, by which, on account of the guilt of one, all the kindred perish. So it's possible that they just fell away because the patriarch made a mistake. They all went the wrong way. Either way, as you kind of wrap this up, the tables are turned. The accusers and their families, those are the ones who experience the perils of the lion's den. In Daniel 6:25-28, then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land. May your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and enduring forever. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. God uses King Darius to basically become his own personal cheerleader to the surrounding nations. All that were influenced by the Medes and the Persians, all those people that came in contact with them, the law went out. They were to fear and tremble at Daniel's God. Because Daniel's God is real. Daniel's God is alive. And Daniel's God is forever sovereign. Daniel, his God, he is powerful. Daniel's God, he is the provider. Daniel's God is a personal, intimate God. So for the reign of King Darius and also the reign of King Cyrus, Daniel continued to serve the sovereign God. And Daniel prospered happily ever after. So what? Daniel, he was committed to serve the sovereign God. Regardless of the external pressures that were around him, Daniel's daily routine of prayer and worship, that wouldn't be deterred. It was going to be a constant in his life. Daniel loved God. And it was clearly visible to all the people that he came in contact. There was something different about Daniel. Let me put it to you this way. As I said, I've had the opportunity to be here for about 2 years. And I've had the privilege of interacting with community members throughout our town and our community around us. This church, for 40 years, it has been used by God. And it would be said that this church as a whole has served the sovereign God. Let me ask it this way. If Calvary Bible Church was to be facing extinction, if we were to just disappear, would there be people outside of our church, would they be grieved over our absence? If there was something that was going to happen to us as a church, would this influence or impact other people? Would they lose sleep and food, and would they hurt that we're not here? That doesn't really navigate how we go about our business here, because we're going to serve God and we're going to look to His Word for our direction in all things. We're not going to be people pleasers, but it is important to realize what testimony this church has in our community. Thankfully, as I said, for 40 years, this church has a great testimony. It would be said that this church has served the sovereign God. People in our community, I have heard them testify that we as a church, we love God. And that love for God is visible to those that we have come in contact with, to those that we have rubbed elbows with, and it kind of spilled over love upon. Praise the Lord for that. And I want to encourage you, please don't grow weary in well-doing. Keep on the good fight of doing this. It is incredible. I want to make sure that this is true of us as individuals as well. Just not as a corporate body of believers, but let's make it personal. How's our daily routine? When it comes to our walk with God, is time with God in our daily life, is that a non-negotiable? That it's just not going to be something that misses in my day. It's going to happen. Is our love for God personally, is that clearly visible to all around us? Is it something that is maybe so ingrained into the fiber of our being, into who we are, that people can just see it? It just comes as second nature to us. Is it visible? Is it something that is backed up with action? So let me ask you, what's eating you? It's my hope and prayer that what is eating you is an overflowing, visible love for the Almighty Sovereign God, whom we have the privilege to serve. Let's not take that for granted this week. Dear Lord,